Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the December 17th, 2019 meeting of the Vacaville Planning Commission. We'll start with the roll call. Everyone, please remember to use the screens to turn your microphones on.
Which button? This one.
Can we have the roll call, please?
Which button?
Good evening, planning commissioners. Chairman Polly.
Here?
Here. Commissioner Brett. Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you. Would you all please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Communications. Director Brierly, do we have any communications?
No, we don't have any communications tonight.
I assume since we have an updated staff report, we'll address that at the time that staff report comes up.
Yes.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. Are there any proposed changes to the agenda from any commissioners? Seeing none, I'll take a motion for approval of the agenda. Commissioner Eldridge,
I move approval of the agenda.
do I have a second?
I'll second.
I have a second from Commissioner, was that Beaumont or Johnson? Commissioner Alan Johnson. All those in favor indicate aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Any abstentions? The agenda passes. Next item is business from the floor. This is the time to address the commission with issues that are not on the agenda for tonight, but that are within the commission's subject matter jurisdiction. We typically limit comments to 3 minutes per speaking individual or group, though if it's small and there's an amount of detail, we can provide some extra time. Is there anyone from the audience who would like to address the commission on an item that is not on tonight's agenda? I don't see anyone moving forward, so I will go ahead and close business from the floor. Next item, number 6, is the consent calendar. We have 2 items. Item A is approval of the minutes, and item B is approval of the Planning Commission meeting calendar for the year 2020. Do we have anyone wishes to pull any items from the consent calendar? Seeing none, I'll take a motion to approve both items as a single motion. Do I have a motion? I have a motion from Commissioner Johnson. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second from Commissioner Aldridge. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed, nay? Any abstentions? Item passes. Item number 7 is the public hearing on the Vacaville Hotel, file number 18305. Who will be making the presentation tonight?
I will today.
Okay, before we start, to remind members of the audience, we have staff make an open presentation. Commissioners will ask questions of staff. We then open to members of the public to come in and speak. We usually ask the applicant to make the first presentation if they want, and then it's open to everyone else. Typically, we limit comments to 3 minutes, but again, if it's not a lot of public commenters and there's a lot of detail, we can extend the time. After that, the commission will close the hearing, we'll discuss and take a vote. Staff, go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, members of the Planning Commission. I will be presenting the Vacaville Hotel project tonight. Staff received a plan development request to construct a 4-story hotel, drive-through restaurant, and retail and office buildings at the corner of Vacaville Parkway and East Monte Vista Avenue. The project site is 5.43 acres in size. It includes 4 buildings, 80,000 square feet approximately of hotel, 4,600 square feet. Yes.
Can we?
Is it VOD?
I'm not sure.
Try that, I think.
If you'll pardon us, it's a fairly new system, and so we're reminding ourselves, since we use it once a month, how to bring things up.
Anybody?
The button VOD, Video on Demand, will allow you to see the presentation, but it does take a moment.
There we go. Thank you.
Oh, good. Okay. Okay. Thank you. So I'll just start from the project summary again to just make that a little bit better. The project site is 5.43 acres in size, and it includes 4 buildings, approximately 80,000 square feet hotel, a 4,600 square feet restaurant and retail building, and 1,500 square feet office building. There's 242 parking spaces proposed. They're also proposing parameter landscaping as well as on-site landscaping, and they are proposing to install 2 driveways. The project includes a few requests. They are requesting to change the zoning designation from industrial park to general commercial. And we also received a request to amend the Vacaville Golden Hills Business Park Policy Plan to place the property and the adjacent SID property within Area 1 and allow hotels as a permitted use within the policy plan. We also received a request to subdivide the property into 3 separate parcels. And we did receive requests for exceptions to development standards for building height and floor area ratio. And staff was able to make the required findings to recommend for Planning Commission to recommend to City Council for approval. Here's one of the elevations for the hotel. It includes metal panels, brick, and cast stone materials. Here we have a rendering of the hotel. And these are the elevations for the restaurant, retail, and office building. A mitigated negative declaration was prepared for this project, and it was circulated for the 30-day public review period, which ended yesterday, which is why we submitted updated memos with some of the comments that we received after the staff report was posted. We did receive comments from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Caltrans, Department of Toxic Substances Control, and Central Water Quality Board. The comments received did result in revisions to some of the mitigation measures. However, there were no new impacts that were not identified in the original document. Therefore, recirculation of the document is not required. We did find that the project will have a less than significant impact with the mitigation measures incorporated. In conclusion, staff supports the project because it meets the required findings, it complies with the general plan, it's consistent with the Natri Airport plan, and it also provides needed hotel facility, commercial services, and continues to development within the Vacaville Golden Hills Business Park Policy Plan. So staff recommends by simple motion to recommend to the City Council to adopt the mitigated negative declaration, approve the zoning map amendment, policy plan amendment, tentative parcel map, and plan development requests for the Vacaville Hotel project, subject to the conditions of approval. That concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, please let me know, and the applicant's here too if you have any questions.
Do I have any of the commissioners with questions for staff at this time? I don't see, I see Commissioner Beaumont. Commissioner Beaumont, go
Yeah,
ahead.
so does that recommendation include this revised
Yes, the
Okay.
revised mitigation measures.
Okay.
That's correct.
And then I have another question. In the very back on page 104, we're talking about sewer capacity, and there's a total of about 90,000 gallons per day available for the Vacaville Business Park, and this is taking up a third of that. And the Vacaville Business Park's a big area, and I'm wondering, a third of that's a lot. Could you explain that to me, if that's going to be a problem in future developments?
So the sewer capacity transfer that was done for the hotel project was done by the utilities department, so it's going to be a little bit difficult to explain. But what was found out of the memo is that it was approved that the capacity was there. It was merely just transferred. It was additional capacity that was merely just transferred for this project. It was allocated for this project. And it went through the process and got approval by the city manager.
Okay, thank you.
Do I have other commissioner questions for staff at this point? Seeing none, since this is a public hearing, I'm going to go ahead and open the public hearing and first invite the applicant or the applicant's representative to come forward and address the commission with any comments they would like to make at this time. Not required, but you're welcome to do so. Okay, would any other member of the public like to come up? And if so, please just give your name when you come up for the record. And hold on for a moment as I make sure I have the proper microphone identified here.
It'll turn.
Right, I'm looking for the proper podium. Proceed.
Thank you. Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Teresa Stout. I'm a resident of Vacaville. I just have a question regarding the height of the building. The current allowance for buildings of this type are, I believe it's 31 foot, and they want an exemption for 59. Is that what it was? Thank you. I had it originally and I had set it down. But anyway, so to go from a 2-story to a 4-story, I understand that potentially that there was, the exemption was received from the Nut Tree Airport flight plan because they are out in that area. However, 2 extra stories, has the FAA put in their 12 cents yet? Because it's 2 stories higher than what is normally allowed out there, and there was an exemption. And litigation for this city, based on grabbing that exemption, could prove to be quite high in the risk value by adding 2 stories so close to the airport. Just wondering.
I'd like to ask staff for any response to the comments.
So when we submitted the application to the Airport Land Use Commission for consistency review, there was a diagram that was included that showed that the FAA height, the maximum height requirement, that the hotel would actually be under that. So it is actually under the FAA height requirement that's allowed, which is also listed in the policy plan.
And a little bit further, so is the Airport Land Commission here in Solana really, they take the responsibility of looking at whether a land use or a building height is safe and consistent with the airport? So are they the ones who look at it?
Yeah, so they reviewed the project to make sure that it was consistent based off of the height, the number of stories, the zone change that's along with this project. They reviewed all of that and determined that the number of stories, height is consistent with both of their airport plans.
Okay, and we have a document on that in the staff
Yeah,
report?
it's attachment 7. The resolutions are attachment 7.
Okay, thank you. Do we have other members of the public who wish to come up and address this particular issue? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing and ask for commissioner comments in preparation for then anybody who wants to make a motion. So I see Commissioner Brent Johnson.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, and I posed it earlier today of staff, and she didn't have the direct answer, so maybe we can ask the applicant. I'm curious as to the proposed TOT that this project is going to generate, the transient occupancy tax, which is obviously a big benefit to the city and something that all hotel projects, contribute. So do you have a rough estimate of what that is for this project?
And please state your name for the record.
Hi, my name is Jaspreet Sidhu, and I'm the applicant. So the total tax that the hotel pays is 22% towards the city and state, and roughly, I believe it is about 14% goes towards the city for TOT. And I'm not sure exactly how much of that percentage is allocated just for the city, but that roughly amounts to, for on a monthly revenue of the total tax we pay towards all sales and everything, is about $70,000 to $80,000 a month in tax. So
Perfect.
how much ever kind of comes out to the city.
Okay, thank you. We'll do the math.
All right.
Do I have other commissioners with comments? Then do I have anyone who wishes to make a motion? I see Commissioner Beaumont.
Yeah, I'd move to recommend that the city council adopt a mitigated negative declaration, approve the zoning amendment, policy plan amendment, tentative parcel map, and plan development for the Vacaville Hotel project, subject to the conditions of approval, and adding to include a recommendation to the city council to adopt a mitigated negative declaration with revised mitigation measures.
Commissioner Alan Johnson, were you going to second?
I was going to second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Would all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed, nay. Any abstentions? Then it passes unanimously. Director Brierley, what's the next step?
To consider the policy plan amendment and the request.
Our next public hearing is item B, the accessory dwelling unit ordinance, which is file number 19-352, which staff planner will be making the presentation.
I will be tonight.
Okay, please proceed.
Thank you, Commissioners. Tonight I bring to you a bunch of revisions to our current accessory dwelling unit ordinance, and I will kind of explain why. So tonight we request that you recommend that City Council approve these amendments to Municipal Code Chapters 1409.122 and to the Definitions Chapter 1402.016, so that they're consistent with the new state laws. Project summary. A little bit of background before I get to this portion. As you may remember, in 2016 and early 2017, the state legislature passed a few laws allowing accessory dwelling units as a permitted by right use. Since then, the legislature, actually just this year, the governor signed on October 1st, a series of bills, 6 new bills that further amends those that allowed by right, essentially reducing the authority that jurisdictions have over these accessory units. The changes are, it was signed in October. The changes are effective January 1, 2020. Without this amendment to the municipal code, our current law would end up being, our current ordinance rather, would end up being null and void. So we are trying to keep up with the times as much as we possibly can, while new information is still coming to us. State Department, another nuance with this that kind of adds to our speed. The State Department of Housing and Community Development has essentially the final approval authority over our ordinance. Last year, or the previous laws, we were required to submit for their review, so that they knew we had local ordinances. This one, we actually have to submit for their review and approval for consistency with the state laws. So not really sure what that time frame looks like. The sooner we can get it to them, the sooner we can know whether or not we're on the right track. Project summary. As I mentioned, there are quite a few changes that were made. We tried to simply list out what they were in the staff report. I will discuss what they're in the staff report for the benefit of the public. In the slides, I just had them as very generally identified in the slides. So one of the new changes, one of the big pieces in the new changes was the size limit of the accessory dwelling units. It is now stated size units in conjunction with the fact that we're also now required to allow it in multifamily and mixed zoning. Prior to it was just in single family zoning. Now it's any residential zoning is allowed to have an accessory dwelling unit. There are some nuances on that. For single family zoning areas where there's a single family existing structure, by right they can have a 800 square foot accessory dwelling unit for a single bedroom, 1,200 if it's a 2-bedroom. Maximum height is 16 feet, with the setbacks being 4 feet to the rear and to the sides. There is also the possibility where multifamily dwelling units are existing, it's a maximum of 25% of the existing multifamily units. So if there's a fourplex on a particular parcel, 25% would be they can have one more accessory dwelling unit. Parking, another fun little piece for the parking. Garage conversions are allowed and/or construction on existing parking. So, for example, in the multifamily areas, if you were to build a new structure on existing parking, we are now prohibited from requiring any kind of replacement parking, whether it's conversion or new structure. So that was a new piece. Site coverage, kind of another weird one. We are required to allow 800 square feet. However, if it is over 800 square feet in a single family zone, the lot coverage cannot exceed more than 10% of the base zone. For example, if the lot coverage is 40% and their request for 850 square foot lot or 850 square foot unit, it cannot exceed 50% of the total lot coverage. So you just get that 10%. And then, of course, it still has to meet the 4-foot setbacks and the 16-foot in height. And pretty much multifamily sites. As I mentioned, it also includes mixed uses or mixed use sites, which we're still kind of massaging where we're going to have those mixed use sites, but those will be applicable as well. Junior accessory dwelling units is also kind of a newer thing now with this new law. That is a 500 square foot structure or 500 square foot unit with separate living, eating, and sleeping. Does not have to have necessarily a separate bathroom, but you do have to have that separate living, eating, and sleeping area. So it does require an efficiency kitchen. Questions that we actually had earlier today. I did get one phone call from a local resident, and that is regarding existing non-conforming uses. So if there's an existing legal non-conforming use, yes, that can be converted into an ADU. If it's an existing illegal non-conforming use, it cannot be. That is still in the law that it cannot be converted. Now, of course, there are ways to bring in an illegal non-conforming into to meet the legal rules. If they can meet the legal standards, then it becomes a legal non-conforming use and then changes the situation. But if it's an illegal non-conforming, it cannot be converted. Our processing has now, it is still a ministerial, essentially building permit that can be submitted for and applied for. Prior to, we had 120 days to review, make sure it was consistent and compliant with our local ordinance. It has been decreased to 60 days. And the owner occupancy piece is the very last one. So currently, owner occupancy, there can be a deed restriction requiring owner occupancy being in the primary structure or in one of those structures that's on the unit. That is, with the new state law, waived until January 1, 2025. What happens after that is unsaid, but that requirement is waived until January 1, 2025.
A question for that.
Yes.
For those existing accessory dwelling units that have that recorded against the property, that the owner must occupy one of the two of them, does that existing requirement also go into suspension until that time, or is it just for new units?
To my knowledge, that was not reflected retroactively. Barton, am I accurate on that? So,
Yes, you're correct.
Okay, so if it's
we can't make that a condition of any
new
approval going forward until January 1st, 2025, but it still applies to anything that's already been approved.
So just for the new structures during that 5-year time period. With the state law, the adoption of this ordinance to be consistent with state law is exempt from CEQA, so there was no CEQA review or action necessary. And with that, I make a recommendation that by simple motion, planning commissioners approve or recommend that City Council approve these amendments. I will add, after conversing with our legal department, as I mentioned, there is still some new legal information interpretation coming into light with this, since it has just been approved in October, with 6 different legislatures that we're trying to combine into one. So with this motion, I also add that Planning Commission allow any necessary revisions based on updated legal interpretations if available.
Certainly seems like it's one of those where the staff report said, our best interpretation of unclear legislation, so a difficult setup on that.
Yes, sir.
And I know this can't go to the city council at least until the middle of January. And so, Commissioners, if there's something that's very unclear on this, and we want to ask for some changes or for some additional time, let's go ahead and make sure we deal with that tonight, because this won't go to the council until after that January 1st deadline in any event. So I see first a question from Commissioner Beaumont. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, so is the process where they come in and get the permit and then find out how big the accessory dwelling unit is going to be, or is this where they already have one and they have to get it permitted, as if it's illegal, or what's the process of, because there's so many different size requirements, that how is it for the people that want to build one? What's their process?
So it depends if it's a new structure or a conversion of an existing structure or an addition to an existing structure. If it's a new structure, what has been occurring is folks have been coming in, we've been pulling their plot plans, and they want to know, can they build an accessory dwelling unit and what are the restrictions? And we give them those options. So in this particular situation, if it were, actually I think, this graphic might kind of help illuminate what I'm trying to say. So if it's a new detached structure, which most of them have been,
Okay.
then it is, okay, we look at it, minimum now is we have to allow an 800 square foot. So if the 800 square foot with the 4 feet, make sure that all fits with the building code and the fire code, and then they're good to go. If they want to do something larger than that, that's when we start looking at the different nuances based on that particular request. And the same thing with a conversion or an attached structure.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Do I have other commissioners that have questions for staff at this point? Commissioner Aldrich.
If someone wants to do the junior ADUs, how would we know what they're doing inside the walls of their houses if they didn't come in and apply?
So the expectation is that they would come in and request a building permit to be able to build, essentially section off a room into a separate piece, separate from everything else. But you know, we don't have the ability to go into everybody's house and make sure that they're complying with the state law. It would be if we get a complaint or we get some sort of comment, we can follow up on it that way.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other commissioners? At this point, this is a public hearing, so I will open it for any member of the public who wishes to come down and address the commission on this issue. If you come down, just please let us know your name before you start your comments. Please have any member of the public who wishes to comment? And I know you've spoken before, but separate records, so please.
No problem.
Thank you for the reminder of the light.
Good? Okay. Teresa Stout. So there was a series of 6 different bills, 5 of them assembly bills and 1 Senate bill. You've all seen them. They were in your packet. I've gone through them as well, and the planning department has done quite a job trying to assess what all of these mean. I was here when we did the first ADU ordinances back in 2016, where we were fixing them up and stuff. And they had controls in that it maintained the rights of neighborhoods. These new bills support the development of multiple ADUs on a single property, remove owner occupancy requirements, and limits the impact fees, which have yet to been spoken on. All of this is kind of problematic, and I guess my biggest thing is, I get it. I know that we have to go forward with this and that it all starts in January. But some of these bills were passed in February. AB 670 was passed at the end of August. We had an opportunity, we've had several opportunities to get ahead of this. And this is where I think my major issue has always been, and that's with transparency with the city and working with this stuff. Because if we come on December 17th, when everyone's out Christmas shopping right now and not watching their TV set or not here, as we can see, the problem is that the city could have included the public long before this. If there was a group of us that sat as an advisory, oversight, partners in crime, whatever we want to call it, that we all sat together and came up with this ordinance, even though this stuff is all being told, you're doing this, this, and this. Because with all of us looking at it and all these sets of eyes, it would make it easier to swallow. But the way it is right now, it's being shoved down the throat and it doesn't feel good. Yes, I get it. I read all the bills. Yeah. And, but Christina, I mean, and Barton, you guys, we need the transparency. We need to work together as a team. If this stuff is all moving forward, which it is, and HOAs and nothing else counts anymore, then we all got to be in this together and not just being told by one department in this city of what must be done. It would feel better massaged if all of us were part of that team. Thank you.
Ms. Dutt, before you leave,
Oh,
question.
yes, of
Are
course.
you asking the commission to delay action on this so that there can be more review by a citizen group, or this a general comment of when things have time, bring them earlier? I'm trying to make sure I understand what you're asking.
I think, well, it has to go to city council in the middle. Is it a public hearing at the city council meeting, or is it just going forward for consent?
Director Barley, would this be
Yes, it would be a public hearing at the city council.
I see Commissioner Johnson for just a second. I want to,
So it's a comment that I've made over the last few years, is that work together as a city, make it more inclusive so we don't feel like it's one more thing that we have to do. And I completely get, I read the bills, I completely get these are things that we're supposed to do. But wouldn't it feel better if it came from the all of us instead of being directed by one department? Because it makes them look like the bad guys, and it does. So would I love for it to be held over? Yes, of course I would. Is it going to help it any? I don't think so. I just would like to somehow see in the future there be a bit more group work done on this.
Commissioner Brent Johnson.
I'm curious as to the lack of transparency that you see, because I feel that it's been very transparent as to the process, and then also curious as to what specific types of community involvement you'd like for gathering input from, I mean, the reality is non-expert people in this field to provide input on items that require expertise.
It's not the expertise, it's the fact that we are part of Vacaville. We are homeowners. We are an expert in our own neighborhood. It's not about the expertise. In fact, wouldn't it be better if a bunch of us lay folks who really know nothing, which we actually know stuff, wouldn't it be better for everyone if it wasn't just you sitting up on the dais, or if it wasn't just Christine sitting over here telling us what we need to do, and rather a group of folks that you trust, that's your next door neighbor, the folks that are around you saying, hey, have you seen this bill? Have you looked at that? Check this one out. This isn't new stuff. The governor said when he came into office that this stuff was coming down the pike. And sure enough, back in February, the first one came down. All I'm saying is just say if it was October, because some of these didn't get put in place until October 7th. if October 7th is your drop dead date, already have some folks sitting around that campfire that are already set for this, that they can spread the news, that they can bring it to the rest of Vacaville instead of it coming to them on December 17th.
I am going to jump in because
Please.
I agree. And we do have those folks, and we're very benefit of them being on our planning staff and living in our community and speaking with their neighbors and community members and encouraging input as well. So what you're saying makes perfect sense, and I feel that we are engaging in that manner. I disagree that we should have town hall meetings for most items that come up. I don't feel that's appropriate, and it impedes the progress and speed at which we need to take action in our city. And so in that matter, I disagree, but I think as it relates to moving this particular ordinance forward, I think that there's, like you said, time prior to the council meeting, and obviously staff is still working some of the nuance through some of the nuances of the legislation, that there is further opportunity for the community to provide input, as well as voice their concerns with council. But for the sake of moving this forward tonight, I don't have any other additional comments.
Yeah, and I agree that the planning staff are our main line, our front line, but the planning staff only went to Benicia and Dixon as far as finding out what they are doing regarding these same ordinances, rather than putting out a deeper net into towns or cities that are our size and are outside of our county. We can help with that.
Hold on, Mike. Commissioner Fortney.
Christina, the language we have here is to be consistent with state legislation that is taking place January 1, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. My question to you is, I understand the transparency. ADUs, we're in this situation with the ADUs for housing affordability. So
Yes.
I understand the transparency, but at the end of the day, does this not benefit the residents of Vacaville? I mean, are you attacking the ADUs or just the process we got to? I hear the bad guy is certain departments, but we're being consistent with state legislation.
Of course.
So where's the bad guy here?
It's not necessarily bad guy. It's who's feeding this stuff. So ADUs, as they stood, the way that we had written them originally, benefited the neighborhoods because it talked about that it needed to look like this, it needed a 6-foot setback, it needed, all the items were laid out beautifully. Great job done by the planning department with input from a group of folks that had come forward, because we were all in that one together. What I'm saying about this is, yes, I get that it's state law, all these different laws that are coming down. Every single paragraph, I won't say every single one, let's say 80% of the paragraphs from which we are drawing ordinance information says the law is unclear. You read the packet as well as I did. It said the law is unclear in almost every single paragraph. In that case, that gives us room. It doesn't change the law, but it gives us room to interpret it and see what the state does as far as accepting it through the HCD. So what I'm saying is nobody is the bad guy, just be inclusive with all the good guys. It makes it an easier pill to swallow, is all I'm saying.
Thank you for your clarification.
Okay.
Do I have other members of the commission that have questions for our speaker? And thank you for coming up and
Thank you.
engaging us on that. Do we have other members of the public who wish to come up and then address the commission on this item? Seeing none, go ahead and close the public hearing. Commission member comments on this. Who wants to start us off? Commissioner Alan Johnson.
Okay, it's obvious we have to come in line with state law, and I don't have the actual motion in front of me, but when we do make the motion, I called staff earlier this evening, and there's some language in here that just needed some cleanup. So when we make our motion, I would just suggest that our motion include cleanup language before it goes to council.
Yes, sir.
So we're making that motion?
Do we have any other comments before a motion? Seeing no other comments, I will say, darn, I wish the state legislature wouldn't wait until October to give us legislation we then need to act on. Looks like some of the stuff may have come early, but then with so many different bills, it keeps changing, and we don't get the final one until October. Frustration, but the state legislature is frequently frustrating, so this isn't anything new. Commissioner Alan Johnson, did you want to go ahead and make the motion?
I will go ahead and make it.
Okay, go ahead and make your motion.
Okay, by simple motion, approve the resolution to recommend to the City Council approval of the amendments to municipal codes 1409-122 and 1402-016 to be consistent with the new state law and to make the...
And staff, you had additional language you would recommend to put in?
Yes, sir. Necessary revisions based on updated legal interpretations, if available.
Okay, is that your motion?
That was, and also with the cleanup language.
Okay, and then the next slide on is Commissioner Aldridge.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Commissioner Beaumont, excuse me,
In the
step back
recommended
on.
actions in our packet, there's an additional section of chapter. The chapter 1402-014. There's 3 different chapters. It's not included here on the page 111.
Yep. 2, 3.
Yes.
Yes.
So, staff, sounds like there's a different motion on the agenda versus what is in the staff report.
Yeah, that's what I see.
Thank you, Commissioner Beaumont.
Thank you.
You're correct. On the recommendation that's on the staff report is the recommendation. So I did leave off that particular recommendation. I apologize.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask us to start over since Commissioner Alan Johnson made the motion. I will ask if he wishes to make a replacement motion.
I will. My motion is to recommend that the City Council adopt amendments to the Municipal Code Chapters 1409-122, 1402-014, and 1402-016 with the added language
With necessary revisions based on updated legal interpretations, if available, and clerical revisions.
That's my motion.
And then Commissioner Aldridge, you made the original second. Do you wish to second the replacement motion?
I will second the replacement motion.
Thank you. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Director Barley, what's the disposition?
So the Planning Commission is a recommendation to the City Council. We expect this to go to the City Council for a hearing on January 14th, 2020.
And is this action expected at that meeting, or is this an ordinance amendment that would take 2 hearings?
It would take 2 readings, yes.
Okay, so the first reading would probably be on January 14th, then subsequent at a later date.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for coming in. Our next item, number 8, is business, Land Use and Development Code update. This is not a formal public hearing, though public input is allowed and no action is required. Who is making the staff presentation?
We have our consultant from Lisa Wise, Roger, and he'll let him introduce himself.
With Lisa Wise Consulting. Behind me is Henry Pontarelli, principal with the firm. And we're really delighted to be here. This is a really important project for us, and we're just really pleased to be in Vacaville. Just a little bit of background to myself. I've got over 30 years of planning experience, most of it in the government sector. So I've spent many hours in front of planning commissions and city councils, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you and to talk with you this evening about parking, performance standards, and signs. Are you going to give me the mouse? Yeah, that'll work. Thank you. So what I'd like to do is just give a very quick overview of the Vacaville Code Up zoning code process. I won't go into a lot of detail. I know you've been hearing about it over the last year or so. And then we'll focus particularly on these three sections, which is module 3 of our process: parking, performance standards, and signs. So as you'll remember, the purpose of the Land Use and Development Code update is to ensure that the new code is fully consistent with the general plan and implements the general plan. We're also intending to create a code that is high quality in terms of its design, its look, its functionality and usability, that uses clear modern terms and definitions, that's truly updated, that establishes clear permitting processes for increased efficiency by staff, predictability for users of the code from the private sector. And of course, it has to be consistent with state and federal law. And ultimately, you're looking for a code that's clear, concise, understandable, and easy to use. So we've been at this for a while. November is when we started phase 1 and did the code audit with you. And this was really the information gathering phase, where many of the team from Lisa Weiss Consulting was here talking to you, talking to stakeholders, gathering input, synthesizing it into the code audit that I know has been presented to you. We're now in the phase where we're actually starting to draft the first administrative drafts and then presenting to you those drafts for feedback. So these are not complete documents. You've already looked at use regulations and development standards in the overlay districts. And then coming up on January 21st will be resource protection and subdivisions, and then later administration and permit procedures. And then once we've got your feedback, that from staff, from any members of the public, we'll be presenting the public review draft back to the Planning Commission, making revisions, and then ultimately taking it forward to the Planning Commission and City Council through hearings and adoption. So let's talk a little bit about parking, which is a really important section of your code. We spent a little while before this meeting, meeting with a gentleman who was very clear in his comments about parking for the city of Vacaville. And I just want to set the stage a little bit, because many cities across the country are questioning the traditional approach to parking. And what's happened as we've got into our suburban culture is we really have auto-oriented land use planning. We design our streets to handle cars. We design our parking areas and our shopping centers to handle cars. And we provide generous amounts of parking in those developments. Not finding fault with anybody, that's just the national trend that we've had for many, many years. And that has ultimately led to dispersed patterns of development, because we're so accustomed to driving everywhere that we need then places to park our cars. Vehicle ownership has increased significantly as well. And ultimately, we're hiring transportation engineers and civil engineers to design for cars. And many cities and towns are going, wait a minute, we're reducing travel options for our citizens because it's always about the car. And what about that multimodal way of getting around a city? Walking, biking, using transit or other modes. And so there's a shift, a whole paradigm shift, if you like, in the way we think about parking. And part of this conversation with you tonight is, do you agree with that national trend to reducing parking, or do we want to maintain the levels of parking that Vacaville is comfortable with in the past? So it's really this decision point. Do we stay with what we have, or do we start reducing parking and start thinking about how we get around our cities in a different way? Now, I'm not going to go through all of these. I believe you've seen these in your packet. But what we're really presenting here is a different way of thinking, where the community has very clear goals for equity and affordability and diversity, where you're really thinking about reducing traffic and clean air. The general plan is very clear about many of these goals. And so the paradigm then starts to shift from, do we find a way of providing what the community needs, that is to say, support the community objectives for affordability, public health, accessibility, and so on, and then do we find a solution to support those objectives? And that would come through some of the ideas I'll talk with you this evening, where you'd start to think about sharing parking or providing less parking perhaps. We'd have complementary facilities, so a church facility, for example, next to a shopping center, so that you can share parking. So let's take a look at some of the parking regulation amendments that we're suggesting then. And in terms of applicability, the parking regulations, as they do today, would apply to new buildings and new land uses that are being proposed. The new hotel, for example, that came before you this evening. We'd apply the standards to that hotel development. And then they could also apply to a change or expansion of use. And what we're suggesting here is that where you have an increase of 1,000 square feet or 10%, whichever is less, in the total floor area, and that's gross floor area of the building, then you would provide only the parking for the additional demand created by that expansion of the building. And the existing parking would therefore remain. For a residential use, if you're adding a new bedroom onto an existing house, there would be no need for additional parking. But if you're adding a new unit, notwithstanding what you've just been talking about with ADUs, then you would have to provide parking for that new unit.
Question at this point.
Yes, please.
You talk about new buildings or land uses. For a new use, is that, for example, a change of use with an existing shopping center, going from retail to restaurant or from retail to office? That would be a change of use that would require a parking recalculation?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that is what we're talking about, but there's a nuance to that I'll talk about later, because one of the things we heard from staff is if you have a conventional shopping center, it can be very difficult to calculate the parking because you can calculate for the two restaurants that are there today and then the bookstore and the shoe store and the paintball store or whatever. But over time, things change. So then do you have to start calculating the parking over and over again based on the mix of uses? And we're suggesting a way to simplify that, to make it easier for staff to apply the code and yet still provide a reasonable level of parking for that shopping center.
I look forward to hearing that.
Now we've really looked at the minimum number of parking spaces required. We spent some time working with staff on this. I'll show you an example of this shortly. And what we're looking for is getting rid of the long lists that you have in your current code, simplifying it into a clean table, and then providing flexibility as necessary when we can in the code. We've also added bicycle parking for both short-term and long-term parking, so that you have options. And what the gentleman we were speaking to earlier this evening was concerned that we were mandating the requirement for bicycle parking. And if you read it in the code, we've written it as you shall provide bicycle parking up to these standards. He was saying that should really be a recommendation and a best practice rather than a requirement. Ultimately, that's the kind of policy decision we're looking forward to hearing from you. And then we clarified and simplified the parking area design standards just to make them much easier to use and apply. So here's a portion of the parking table where you can see that it now becomes much easier to decide if you've got a community assembly use, a new church or a temple or whatever, a new Elks Lodge. You need one space for every 100 square feet of assembly seating area. One of the things we learned from staff was to try and get away from the current calculations that would require one parking space for 4 seats. It becomes very difficult trying to figure out how many seats you have in a space. So rather go back to a gross floor area calculation and simplify the standards. So that made it a little hard, honestly, to compare the existing code to the new code because we're dropping that one space per seat requirement. But we have in some areas, like in the commercial uses section, Mr. Chairman, that's what I was talking about earlier, where we've now said it's one space for 300 square feet gross floor area, regardless of the use, whether it's a bookstore or the restaurant. But the one thing about the eating and drinking establishments is we changed the standard to one space per 100 square foot of the dining area only. Now, some codes used to include the kitchen and all the preparation areas in the back, because that was theoretically parking calculated for staff. And we could certainly go back to that approach, or you could have one parking space per staff member. That's rather an old approach today. Most cities these days are just basing their parking requirement based on the eating and drinking area. And then we've got new parking area design standards for circulation and safety, for pedestrian access, lighting, striping, parking, painting. I won't go on into all the details. Happy to answer any questions from you if you do have any. And then a discussion point, honestly, with you is the requirements for buffering and landscaping. I provided an example of a code to staff that we worked on some time ago, and we haven't really resolved how we would like to move forward. But what we were thinking about here is if you have one commercial use next to another commercial use, then the need for buffering between those uses really falls away. However, a commercial use to a residential use or an industrial use to a commercial use and so on should require some level of buffering, whether it's a horizontal distance with a certain landscape requirement or a requirement for a wall or a fence or a number of trees and so on. So that's the approach we're considering, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that later.
Briefly, since you'd love to hear our thoughts, do any of the commissioners like to speak in on that at this time, or like to hold your comments for later? Seems like everybody else hold their comments for later.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And then finally, we're thinking about various types of parking reductions to provide flexibility for sites, where, for example, you might have joint use on a site where you could allow up to a 25% parking reduction. Provide parking off-site within, I believe it's 1,000 feet is what we've offered in the code. So as long as there's some kind of an agreement between the property owners for that shared parking within 1,000 feet. Likewise, if you're within 1,000 feet of a transit stop, then you can reduce your parking by 10%. You're seeing many, many codes across the country taking those kinds of approaches to encourage more people to use transit. And then similarly for passenger loading areas, Uber, Lyft, and so on, rideshare programs, and motorcycle parking too. Now, we've provided some general language regarding a parking demand study, which is a professional study typically prepared by a transportation or transportation engineer to assess a site's parking demand. And then based on those professional recommendations, whether it's a 20% or 30% parking reduction, that really we're relying on the ITE, International Institute of Transportation Engineers standards for parking. And then a traffic management plan. And we've presented very general ideas at this point. I was working in an Arizona community not long ago where they really took parking or traffic management plans to a very sophisticated level, where they really took it beyond the use of designated parking incentives in company vehicles, telecommuting, to various other levels of trying to get people out of their cars and finding ways to incentivize them to come to work using alternate modes of transportation. So if that's something of interest, I can certainly work with Barton and the staff and provide those recommendations to you. Moving on to the performance standards section.
Again, before we do,
Please.
we're at the end of parking. Do any of the commissioners have comments or questions on parking, or should we just get all the way through and then handle all three as a group? Seems All the way through.
All the way through? All right. Thank you, sir. What we're doing with the performance standards section of your code is creating as much as we can measurable metrics to ensure that land uses do not disturb the public health, safety, and welfare or create a nuisance. So most of the performance standards have been carried forward. We are suggesting that some of them might actually be moved out of the zoning code and moved into the municipal code, where they really do make more sense as a nuisance issue. Because typically, you want to deal with a true public health, safety, welfare nuisance issue as quickly as possible. And that relies on the police powers of the municipality. Zoning enforcement typically moves a lot slower. So if you've got a sound complaint, you need to deal with it as quickly as possible rather than wait for the typical enforcement procedure. So we're suggesting that we move some of these into the municipal code with a cross-reference from the zoning code so somebody would know where to go if there was an issue that they needed to pursue. And then signs, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the signs section because the city did update the sign regulations in 2015 following the Supreme Court's decision in Reed v. Town of Gilbert, which really emphasized the need for making sure that your sign regulations are as content neutral as possible. So what we're doing with the sign regulations is mostly carrying forward your standards. We've reorganized and simplified the code, though, so there's a more logical flow and organization to the section. One of the recommendations we are suggesting is beefing up the message substitution section somewhat. This is the section that would allow for the substitution of a commercial for a non-commercial message and vice versa without a sign permit. The exempt sign section has been restructured and organized in a slightly different way. This is signs that wouldn't typically require a permit, whether they're signs not readable from the right-of-way, so in the back of a parking lot for a sign that may be on a shopping center cart corral, for example. So it would have Safeway or place your carts here or advertise some pharmacy or other. I mean, those are signs that are really not intended to be read from the right-of-way, so you'd exempt them from the code. And then within the prohibited sign section, we've suggested breaking them out into two categories, location restrictions and display restrictions. So rather than have one big block of text, you'd break it out. So you'd identify that signs, for example, shouldn't be attached to trees or placed within the right-of-way, or shouldn't be a hazard to pedestrians. And then for the display restrictions, this is, no animation, no smoke, no odors, no balloons, no searchlights, all those kind of display restrictions. And then finally, best practices today suggest a severability section for the sign code. So if you're challenged on the sign code is severable from the rest of the zoning code so that you don't put the rest of your zoning code in jeopardy. And then finally, in the sign measurement section, we're suggesting a lot of illustrations to make it much easier to use, to clarify how, for example, sign area, sign height, sign clearance, building frontage, and so on are calculated and determined. And we found in our practice that as many illustrations as possible really helps not only you as Planning Commission, but any sign installer or business owner wanting to install and erect a sign. We are carrying forward most of the permanent signs and temporary sign sections, just again reorganizing them, cleaning them up, presenting them with illustrations as much as we can. So our next steps, January 21st, we'll be back for the resource protection and subdivision section. By the end of this week, Barton and his staff will have the administrative draft from us. We look forward to coming back next year. And as you know, we'll be updating the VacavilleCodeUp.com website with project news and updates, and we'll do that right after this meeting too. So Mr. Chairman, Commission, it's happy to answer any questions from you, and thank you for your time.
Okay, do we have commissioners who would like to comment So I've got one or two, but I want to let everybody else get things started off. So, Commissioner Beaumont, you're the brave one tonight.
Yeah. Just on page 139, and this didn't have anything to do with what you talked about, but there's a waiver section for removal of parking spaces. If the city removes parking spaces, or I mean, if the owner removes parking spaces from available parking. But I know if we're talking about pedestrian-friendly downtown and we open up some streets and alleyways, the city's going to be taking away parking spaces from business owners, and there's nothing addressed here about that. So would it be good to put something in there that there would be some resolution between the city and the business owners if the city takes something away from the business owners? Because I know of one already that is worried about having his parking spaces taken away if they open up some of the streets to pedestrian traffic.
Commissioner Beaumont, I think that's a really good idea. Would you help me, though? I don't have your consecutive numbering, pages 1 through
I'm sorry.
139.
Okay.
It would be helpful if you could point me
It
to
is
the
actually
document page.
between the parking unloading supplemental standards, part 3.
Got it.
It's the 3rd page.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a good idea. And this was the section for the downtown parking assessment district. And in a recent phone call with Barton, we were actually talking about how we really need to think about that parking assessment district in the context of the downtown specific plan work that's ongoing. So thank you for your comment.
Okay, thank you.
Taking notice of it.
Commissioner Brent Johnson.
Yeah, I just had a couple comments. Not necessarily, I don't know how to phrase it, but I guess due to the kind of suburban nature of our community, a lot of the reduced parking recommendations or regulations for new development that work well in more urbanly populated municipalities just may not be appropriate for our community. So I just want to make sure that as we move forward through this process that we just allow ourselves the flexibility for staff and the director to kind of make judgment calls along the way as new situations come up that maybe are new to our community that would allow us to contemplate something that's maybe not something that we're used to, but would make sense for that particular project. So just that we maintain flexibility.
Very good, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll agree with you on that when we get to any of these mixed-use, higher-density projects that are going on, maybe some of our suburban standards don't work as well there, but in the more typical subdivisions, the sort of standards we have now, if people move towards fewer cars in those areas, we'll see the result. But I think those are ones we can kind of.
And I want to make sure that we leave that flexibility to staff and to Barton and the decision makers. That way, for every time we have a variance, we don't necessarily have to bring it to the commission, because I know a lot of these proposals are time sensitive from a business plan standpoint from the owner or the applicant, and to drag out an extra 2 months to get a reduction of 1 parking space for their business doesn't really make sense. So I think we should allow staff that flexibility to make that decision.
Thank you. Yeah, total agreement.
2 comments that I'd like to throw in. The first one, you asked about bicycles and bicycle parking. Bicycles, parking, and our transportation network are very intimately tied in. People won't go biking if they don't, A, have a safe way to do it, and B, a safe place to put the bike at the end. My preference would be that bicycle parking, whether it's in residential or commercial areas, be required, not optional, but that there be a provision that specific findings could be made, especially for certain types of more business industrial uses, saying that they can show that the nature of the business does not lend itself to bicycle transportation. For example, somebody that sells very large and weighty, bulky items, people aren't going to bike if you're hauling back 500 pounds of rock. So Castle and King probably should not have biking requirements, but just about everybody else should. So My recommendation is that it actually be a requirement with findings for it to be removed. And looking at signs, my main concern on the signage, and I think for a lot of people, it's first the volume. You don't want to overwhelm the architecture of the building by signage. We're not looking to be Las Vegas where the sign is the architecture. So don't overwhelm the architecture with the square footage. Within that, make sure that what we have is equal across the city so that one shopping center doesn't get an advantage over another shopping center. And don't put things in that we're not actually going to enforce. Don't say, oh, you can't do this sort of sign, but we're never going to do it, because that encourages people to just go ahead and ignore it. Put in what we're actually going to live up to, and if we're not going to live up to it, don't put it in. So those would be my comments, and then Commissioner Beaumont would like to speak again, and then after that, Alan Johnson.
Yeah, you asked for comments on the buffer between different type of uses.
Yes, sir.
Wouldn't individual situations dictate what type of buffer you would use, whether it be a wall or landscape or horizontal distance? To me, it would be an individual situation that probably the city could decide what would be the best use of the buffer, because you would look at one and landscape wouldn't work, but the horizontal distance might work because it's a home versus a commercial or something like that. So it's just my opinion that it would be an individual decision on each type of a differing use for a buffer zone.
So Commissioner Beaumont, what I'm hearing you suggest perhaps is a menu of options. So it could be trees, it could be a hedge, it could be a wall, but whatever the height of the wall is needs to be determined at 6 feet, for example, or the depth of the planting needs to be firm. But then you've got different options for achieving the buffering that the planning director and the community development director would approve. Perfect. Thank you.
Commissioner Alan Johnson.
Okay, just two quick comments. You mentioned in the parking section that there's a severability clause so as not to jeopardize the other sections if
Signs.
there was,
Signs,
I'm
sir.
sorry, the signs.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that goes to my question. Isn't there a severability clause in all of the sections so that if issues arise based on our decisions or the council's decisions, that we not jeopardize other parts of the code?
Yeah, Commissioner Johnson, that's absolutely correct. Your whole zoning code will have a severability section.
Okay.
But the attorneys that I've worked with on sign codes, and I don't know what the city attorney's opinion is, but the recommendations I've received from others has been that the sign section should have its own severability clause. It's a more conservative approach, and ultimately the city attorney's office will decide if that's really necessary.
Okay, thank you. And then my second thing is more of just an information question for myself. As you saw tonight with the ADUs, our code is constantly changing based on outside influences, state laws and other things like that. What is the mechanism in which you, during this code update, keep apprised of those changes that are going on? I assume you're having meetings with staff constantly, but is there something that triggers that, or do you have regular meetings where that's a subject or a topic that you address?
Commissioner Johnson, that's a really great question. Our offices are based here in California, and we stay current with what's going on with the legislature and the new bills that they're proposing. We also spend a lot of time working with city staff, and so there's a lot of constant communication, and that's how we stay in touch with what's going on in the community. So
okay.
the other thing that's really important, if I may, is that the code is designed for flexibility. So as new things come down from the legislature or the council, want something new added, the code has got a flexible structure, so it's easy to add anything new into it.
Sure. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Nicolai.
You know, one of the areas, and I've brought this up before, is and it's not addressed in here, and that's why I'm bringing it up. It's temporary, and I'll call them illegal signs. The city of Vacaville and many other cities are famous for signs, advertising, everything. We had an enterprising individual that put a sign up on every telephone all the way down Leisuretowne Road that he can fix any pool. And he put it up high enough that no one could remove it. We've got yard sales, gun shows, the marijuana event at the Cow Palace in San Francisco. We've got signs for everything, and we don't seem to address it. We don't seem to enforce anything regarding those. One of the big ones in most of the housing subdivisions is garage sales. And people are very enterprising in that way too, and they'll put their sign up and they will forget about it, and that sign will be there for 2 weeks, or the remnants of that sign will be on the pole for 2 weeks. You know, and I think it's still something that we need to address in our signage regulations. It's something that I've always seen. I mean, it clutters up the town, and it looks terrible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I managed, as part of my job in a former career, it was long-range planning, code enforcement, and code administration, and I managed the code enforcement division for 10 years, and we called them bandit signs, whether it was landscapers or glass glazers or whatever. Very, very difficult to keep a handle on, but we'll work with Barton and his staff and see what we can do to strengthen the enforcement side.
A lot of people just do it every year. We've got somebody that owns a guitar shop in town that every Christmas his guitar signs go up, and they're up right now, and you'll probably see 50 of them around town.
Sure.
And, you know, we need to do something, whether it's somebody from the city that calls him and says, these are illegal, you know, we're going to start doing this, or we're going to start doing this. We need to have something with some kind of teeth.
Yep.
You know, so that these things don't happen.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Commissioner Eldridge?
Yes, my question is also on signs. When we did the sign discussion back in 2016 or whenever that was, we talked a lot about temporary signs, banners, those feather signs, putting temporary banners up on buildings for specific sales and how many days they could stay up and all that sort of thing. And I certainly want that to be addressed in the sign.
Thank you,
ordinances
Madam
and so
Vice
on.
Chair. We are rolling forward all those existing
Perfect.
standards, yes.
Perfect, because I
Yeah.
think those are extremely important, because sometimes
Indeed.
the banners become tattered and they're flapping in the wind and most unsightly, so thank
Indeed.
you for that.
Yeah.
Commissioner Fortin?
So in the bicycle parking, we have the short-term and the long-term being discussed. And correct me if I'm wrong, so we're at a discussion where we're looking at whether or not this is going to be voluntary for the business owner or required. That's going to be a decision coming up, correct?
That is, yes. Right now,
It-
we've written the code as they're required.
And then at the level, I guess, of quality, that's going to be staff's decision of what's put in there for the parking?
The quality?
I don't want to get us to a point where we're looking at an architectural piece
Got it.
out there for bicycle, and we put a huge burden on the business owner that has to provide bicycle parking, short-term and long-term, instead of just having some tubular steel posts out there or the standard, and we get now architectural, we're looking at design and all of this stuff that we have a burden to the business owner,
Yeah.
which I could see us going down that path.
Okay. All right. As written, Commissioner Fortney, the standards are very simple. It doesn't get into the design as such.
Where will the design come into play there?
I'm not sure that it necessarily needs
will?
to.
Okay.
But if the community really starts to push that, you know, the bicycle racks need to look like bicycles, or, gosh, I've seen them all over the country in crazy designs,
No, and
mining
that's where I was hoping,
communities
so-
with the, you know, the
Sounds like
pulp
you're
wheels.
going, it's, yeah.
Yeah,
It's
you can
strictly standard,
purchase
we don't have
very
any
simple
guidelines.
bike racks that support the bike in 2 places, that are safe, you can lock your bike. That's really all the code needs to say.
Anything else the business owner wants to do to improve that above and beyond is on their own vehicle.
Exactly, yeah.
Not
And then in the
required.
downtown, if you, as a city, through the downtown specific plan, want more enhanced design guidelines for your bike racks, I mean, that's, again, a city decision.
Perfect.
Okay.
Since I don't see any other flashing lights here, I'm going to see if any members of the public would like to come up. Again, we're not taking action tonight, but it is a business item where public input is allowed. Would anyone like to speak on this? Okay. Okay, then I'm going to close the public input and ask for any final commission comments before we are done with this item. Any more? Seeing none, Mr. Barley, what's the next step on this?
The next step will be next month when you have a presentation on the next standards, the subdivision standards, the, what else you said?
Resources and subdivisions.
Yes. And we'll have a few more sections to go through, and then in a couple months here, we'll start putting all these pieces together, and you'll get a full code to look at.
Thank you. Our next agenda item is item number 1, status report on development and major projects, current and then advanced planning.
Hi, I'll be doing the current planning update report for the month of November. We received 4 development applications. We did receive a planned development request to construct 168 senior restricted apartments on a vacant site that's over on the corner of Harbison Drive and Ulatis Drive. We also received a conditional use permit request to construct a neighborhood commercial center on a site that's located at 6140 Leisure Town Road, and that's adjoining the farm at Alamo Creek development. We also received a request to modify an existing telecommunications facility that's located on the rooftop of 479 Mason Street. And we received a modification request from Walmart for a new online grocery pickup area that they'd like to do. There was 4 development review applications that were approved in the month of November. The Planning Commission approved a conditional use permit to construct a new city wall facility. The Director of Community Development approved a tentative parcel map and a design review request to construct a single-family custom home over on Gibson Canyon Road. And the Director of Community Development also approved a request to modify the Bethany Lutheran School and Church Master Plan to construct an approximately 9,000 square feet preschool over at the existing campus that's located at 1011 Ulatis Drive. And the Director also approved an administrative clearance request to reduce the rear yard setback for a patio cover. We received 17 home occupation permits and approved 25. We didn't receive any large family daycare applications or approve any in the month of November. Some of the notable building permit plan checks that we reviewed are plot plans for North Village, Brighton Landing, and different villages out there. And we did not receive any tree removal permits, but we did approve 2. And we also received 2 zoning verification letter requests and issued 2 as well. And the Planning Division did receive 91 development-related inquiries and 0 zoning complaints for the month of November. If you have any questions, I'm here.
This is the vacant lot behind Burlington, across the street from Target and the townhomes right there?
It's
The lot,
right-
it's already been cleared and fenced?
Yeah, it's right across from where the Library Cultural Center, kind of in between Burlington Coat Factory, behind that vacant lot that's located there.
All right, thank you, appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Aldrich?
Yes, today I noticed next to the 99-cent store on Peabody Road, a large parcel of land has been completely fenced off, and there's large equipment. It looks like some sort of sewer pipes and so on that property. Is that being developed?
So this is the 99-cent store
On Peabody Road?
on Peabody. Okay.
It used to be the old Safeway,
Yeah.
but that property has been completely cordoned off and with semi-opaque.
It's over where that vacant land
think
is,
there's
right
a-
next to the 99-cent store, and
Right.
there's a gas station in the corner.
Right.
I haven't heard of any applications or projects in that area. We'll look into it.
Lots of building equipment and large machinery.
Okay.
Building supplies, I should say.
Yeah.
Oh, that could be a staging
It
area.
looks like it is for another project, because I saw it too.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Any other questions? Or?
Nope. Is there anything further on advanced planning?
Advanced planning. So that'll be Barton. Thank you.
So I'll give the advanced planning report, and you've already heard our major projects, the code update and the accessory dwelling unit. The other big one we have is the downtown specific plan. So we are working to get a draft of the first part of that plan, the connectivity and streetscape part of it, and we expect that to be before you in January for your consideration. So that concludes the advanced planning report.
Then we will move on to the director's report, A, council items, and B, tentative schedule.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So at the December 10th City Council meeting, the City Council considered the citywide zone changes that you had considered at your last meeting. The council did move to approve those. I will note that one question that came before the commission was there's a 3 parcels at the end of Adrian Court that somehow were designated in the general plan for park, but were zoned RL6, and we were trying to resolve that issue. You had a request from one of the property owners to not change it to RL6, but to consider changing it to residential estate, and you'd recommend that the city council study that further. And after the hearing, the property owner of the one vacant parcel did contact us and say that they were very much opposed to being changed to residential estate, and they wanted to be RL low density, which is what the current zoning is. They testified to that in front of the city council, and the city council ultimately decided to change the general plan to low density residential to be consistent with the zoning. So that's the outcome of that. The council also heard a request to establish a new PPA, a priority production area, an application to expand our existing PDA, priority development areas. So what those are, priority development areas, are areas in cities where there's an attempt to have it be with housing and sort of denser development and more pedestrian friendly and transit friendly development. We have 2 priority development areas. One's downtown and one is on Allison Drive near the transit center. And we're asking to expand the Allison priority development area to go more down Elmira Road to include the Pony Express Senior Housing Project, since that would be the housing project and that area. And also one of the zone change areas on Peabody Road is changed to high density residential, and so we're proposing to include that in the priority development area. And then these PPAs, the priority production areas, are areas that the state wants to emphasize employment, not housing, but employment. And so we've applied to include the Interchange Business Park and the Vacaville Golden Hills Business Park as priority production areas. And still unsure what that designation means, but it basically is a state recognition that this is an area where we ought to put some resources to improve employment. We made a presentation to the council on a public involvement plan, much like we gave to you, and the council was very appreciative of that and wants to move forward with the public involvement policy, and so we'll be returning to the council for an adoption of an actual public involvement policy. The 2019 building code, the state has adopted changes to that, and then the city has to adopt the state building code, and so the council passed an ordinance they introduced an ordinance which would adopt the 2019 building code. And finally, they had a presentation on cannabis. About 6 months ago, we did a lot of discussion on cannabis, and there's still a lot of questions out there, things hanging out, and council asked us to give an update 6 months later, which ended up being this month. So we gave an update, and basically the update is there's still a lot of unanswered questions, still a lot of things being worked out, and we still don't allow retail stores in Vacaville. There's still questions about deliveries and taxing deliveries. So we presented that information to the council, and they asked us to give us another update in 6 months, so we will return again with that. On the 14th, January 14th, the council will hear the two items that you heard tonight, the Vacaville Hotel and the accessory dwelling unit ordinance. And finally, your next planning commission will be next decade sometime. I remember writing plans about what the vision of the community would be in 2020. Well, it's coming up. And so your next meeting, we have 3 items scheduled at this point. One is the downtown connectivity plan, which I mentioned. Second is the next section of the code update, the resource protection and subdivision. And then the third is the Alamo mixed use project, which is a mixed commercial and housing project on Alamo Drive next to Lucky's on that vacant site there. And so you'll have a full meeting in January. And that concludes my report.
Opportunity for commissioner comments. Do any of our commissioners have, like, say, Commissioner Beaumont?
So I assume our January 7th Planning Commission meeting you mentioned we might have is not happening?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
We got 7 o'clock.
Other comments?
All good.
I think it's the holiday season. Everybody have a really good holiday time, but we've got wrapping and other things to do. Let's stop talking. So I'm going to go ahead and adjourn the meeting and wish everyone the happiest of all the holidays they celebrate.